Crime and Punishment. One morning, as he was leaving the house, Don Camillo discovered that someone had defaced the white wall of the rectory by writing in red letters 2 feet high Don Camillo, which means stevedore, and which undoubtedly referred to a feat of strength and daring which Don Camillo had performed a few days before. It was on Easter morning that Don Camillo had found the colossal chocolate egg tied up with a red silk ribbon on his doorstep. On closer inspection, it turned out to be a formidable egg that resembled chocolate but was actually a 200-pound bomb shorn of its pins and painted a nice rich brown. The donor was not hard to guess, for there was a card attached which read, "Happy Easter," and its receipt had been carefully planned. The church square thronged with people all eyeing Don Camillo and enjoying his discomfort. Don Camillo kicked the egg, which naturally remained immovable. "It's pretty heavy," someone shouted. "Needs a bomb remover squad," suggested another voice.
"Try blasting it and see if it doesn't walk off of its own accord,"
cried a third voice. Don Camillo turned pale, and his knees began to tremble. Then he bent down, and with his immense hands grasped the bomb by its extremities. "Lord," whispered Don Camillo desperately. "Heave ho, Don Camillo," replied a quiet voice that came from the high altar. Slowly and implacably, Don Camillo straightened his back with the enormous mass of iron in his hands. He stood for a moment contemplating the crowd and then set out. He left the church square and step by step, slow and inexorable as fate, crossed the big square. The crowd followed in silence, amazed. On reaching the far end of the square, opposite the party headquarters, he stopped, and the crowd stopped too. "Lord," whispered Don Camillo desperately. "Heave ho, Don Camillo," came a rather anxious voice from the now distant high altar of the church. Don Camillo collected himself, then with one sudden movement brought the great weight up to his chest. Another effort, and the bomb began slowly to rise higher, watched by the now frightened crowd. One moment the bomb was poised above Don Camillo's head, the next it lay on the ground exactly in front of the party headquarters. Don Camillo looked at the crowd. "Return to sender," he observed in a loud voice. "Easter is spelled with an A. Correct and redeliver." The crowd made way for him, and Don Camillo returned triumphantly to the rectory. Don Camillo savored the memory of this feat, and to find it treated as a public joke in the form of a pun plastered in red letters on the rectory wall hurt a most tender spot, his vanity. He tried to cover the inscription with a bucket of whitewash and a large brush, but it was written in aniline red, so that whitewash was completely useless, and the letters only glared more violently. Don Camillo had to resort to scraping, and the job took him easily half the day. When he went to talk things over, he was as white as a baker all over, but in a distinctly black frame of mind. "If I can only find out who did it," he said, "I'll beat the daylights out of him." "Don't be melodramatic, Don Camillo," Christ advised him. "This is some urchin's doing. After all, no one has really insulted you." "Do you think it's proper to call a priest a stevedore?" protested Don Camillo. "And then it's the kind of nickname that if people catch on to it, could stick to me all my life." "You've got broad shoulders, Don Camillo," Christ consoled him with a smile. "I never had shoulders like yours, and yet I bore the cross without beating anybody." Don Camillo agreed that Christ was right, but he was not satisfied, and that evening, instead of going to bed, he stood in a strategic position and waited patiently. Toward 2 o'clock in the morning, an individual appeared in the church square and, with a small pail on the ground beside him, set to work carefully upon the wall of the rectory. Don Camillo didn't give him time even to complete the letter D before he overturned the pail on the fellow's head and sent him flying with a terrific kick in the pants. Aniline dye is an accursed thing, and Smilzo stayed home for 3 days scrubbing his face with every conceivable concoction. When he did go out and work, he was greeted with the nickname of Red Skin. Don Camillo fanned the flames until he discovered, when it was too late, that the handle of his front door had received a coating of red color. Without saying a word, Don Camillo went and found Smilzo at the tavern, and with a blow that was enough to blind an elephant, plastered his face with the paint collected from the door handle. Naturally, the affair immediately took on a political aspect, and since Smilzo was supported by half a dozen of his own party, Don Camillo was forced to use a bench in self-defense. The 6 who had been routed by Don Camillo's bench were sitting. The tavern was in an uproar, and that same evening, an unknown person serenaded Don Camillo by throwing a firecracker in front of the rectory door. Now, the transition from firecrackers to grenades is easily made, and things did seem to be getting out of hand when, one fine morning, Don Camillo received an urgent summons to the city because the bishop wished to speak to him. The bishop was old and bent, and in order to look Don Camillo in the face, he had to raise his head considerably.
Don Camillo, he said, you are not well. You need to spend a few months in a beautiful mountain village. Yes, yes. The parish priest at Punta Rosa died recently, and so we can kill 2 birds with one stone. You will be able to reorganize the parish for me, and at the same time you will regain your health. Then you will come back as fresh as a rose. Don Pietro, a young man who will make no trouble, will substitute for you. Are you pleased, Don Camillo?
No, Excellency, but I shall leave as soon as your Excellency wishes.
Good, replied the bishop. Your discipline is the more commendable as you accept without discussion my instructions to do something that is against your personal inclinations.
Excellency, wouldn't you be displeased if the people of my parish said that I ran away because I was afraid?
No, replied the old man, smiling. Nobody on this earth could ever think that Don Camillo was afraid. Go with God, Don Camillo, and leave benches alone. They never constitute a Christian argument.
The news spread quickly in the village after Pepone announced it in person at a special meeting. Don Camillo is going, he proclaimed, transferred to some godforsaken mountain village. He is leaving tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock. Hooray! Shouted the entire meeting. And may he croak when he gets there. All things considered, it's the best way out, said Pepone. He was beginning to think he was the king, and the Pope rolled into one. If he had stayed here, we would have had to put him in his place. This saves us the trouble. And we will let him slink away like a whipped cur, howled Brusco. Make the village understand that anyone who is caught on the church square at 3 o'clock will hear from the party. The time came for Don Camillo to say goodbye to Christ above the altar. I wish I could take you with me, sighed Don Camillo. I'll go with you just the same, replied Christ. Don't worry. Have I really done anything bad enough to deserve being sent away? Asked Don Camillo. Yes. Then everyone is against me, sighed Don Camillo. Everyone, replied Christ. Even Don Camillo himself disapproves of what you have done. That is true enough, Don Camillo acknowledged. I could have hit myself. Keep your hands quiet, Don Camillo, and a pleasant journey to you. In a city, fear can affect 50% of the people, but in a village, the percentage is doubled. The roads were deserted. Don Camillo climbed into the train, and as he watched his church tower disappear behind a clump of trees, he felt very low indeed. Not even a dog remembered me, he sighed. It is clear that I have failed in my duties, and it is also clear that I am a bad egg. The train was a local that stopped at every station, and therefore it stopped at Basqueto, which consisted of 5 houses about 4 miles away from Don Camilo's own village. Suddenly, Don Camilo found his compartment invaded. He was hustled to the window and saw a crowd of people clapping their hands and throwing flowers. Pepone's man had said that if anyone in the village showed up to see you off, it meant trouble, the farmer from Strada Lunga explained. And so to avoid trouble, we all came on here to say goodbye. Don Camilo was completely dazed and felt a humming in his ears. When the train moved off, the entire compartment was filled with flowers, bottles, bundles, and parcels of all sizes, while poultry with their legs tied together clucked and protested from the baggage racks overhead. But there was still a thorn in his heart. And the others? They must really hate me to have done such a thing. It wasn't even enough for them to get me sent away. 15 minutes later, the train stopped at Bosco Planche. There, Don Camilo heard his name called, and going to the window, he found Mayor Pepone and his entire gang. Mayor Pepone made the following speech. Before you leave, it seems to us proper to bring you the greetings of the people and good wishes for a rapid recovery, which will enable a speedy return to your spiritual mission. Then, as the train began to move, Pepone took up his hat with a sweeping gesture, and Don Camilo also removed his hat and remained standing at the window with it poised in the air like a statue of the Risorgimento. The church at Punta Rosa sat on the top of the mountain and looked like a picture postcard. When Don Camilo reached it, he inhaled the pine-scented air deeply and exclaimed with satisfaction, "A rest up here will certainly do me good, which will enable a speedy return to my spiritual mission."